Hey everyone, in part 3 of this video series, I'm going to show you how to replace the clutch assembly on a Honda S2000. The first thing you want to do is fabricate something that would be equivalent to a flywheel ring gear holder. Basically what you want to do is fabricate something that locks the flywheel in place so that it doesn't spin while you try to remove the clutch assembly. Something that works really perfectly for this is a 6mm Allen wrench with the long end stuck into one of the bolt holes on the engine side, with the short end stuck into the flywheel gear. Other folks have wedged a flat screwdriver or a pry bar in the flywheel gear. However, in my opinion, using an Allen wrench is a really elegant method. Next, you'll want to remove the pressure plate, which is secured to the flywheel with 9 bolts. These bolts have a 12-point bolt head as opposed to a more traditional 6-point bolt head, so ensure that you have the right 12-point sockets. Additionally, in order to prevent warping, the pressure plate bolts must be carefully removed in a crisscross pattern similar to the camshaft tower bolts or the cylinder head bolts. Having said that, use a 10mm socket to carefully remove the 9 bolts securing the pressure plate to the engine. When the pressure plate comes off, the release bearing and the friction disc will come off with it. Now you'll want to remove the flywheel, which is secured to the engine with 8 bolts. Like the pressure plate bolts, these bolts are also 12-point bolt heads. To make things even more difficult, the bolt heads are very shallow, which makes these bolt heads very likely to be rounded off if you use a traditional socket. If you take a look at a traditional socket, you will notice the inner walls taper towards the end of the socket. In order to ensure that you don't round off the flywheel bolt heads, I recommend taking a sacrificial 17mm socket and grinding down the end of the socket so that there is no tapered end. When I grinded down my own socket, I literally rubbed it against the driveway until the end of the socket was removed. This ensures that the end of the socket will get a full grip on these short flywheel bolts. Having said that, use your modified 17mm socket to remove the 8 bolts securing the flywheel to the engine. An impact gun will make quick work of these. There will be a large washer that sits between the bolts and the flywheel, which you'll want to keep for reassembly. If you are replacing your flywheel, you will want to install a new pilot bearing. The pilot bearing will only fit onto the flywheel in one direction. Use something like a 37mm socket and carefully tap the new pilot bearing into the flywheel. Afterwards, apply a light coating of high-temp urea grease to the inner race bearing surface. Installation of the new flywheel is pretty much the reverse of the removal. Use your modified 17mm socket to install the 8 bolts securing the flywheel to the engine with the large washer sandwiched in between them. Make sure to replace your flywheel ring gear holder, or in my case, a 6mm Allen wrench, so that you can properly torque each of the bolts in a crisscross pattern to 94 foot-pounds. After installing the flywheel, you'll want to lubricate the friction disc. Apply some high-temp urea grease to the splines of the friction disc and slide the friction disc along the transmission input shaft. This should lubricate both the friction disc and the transmission input shaft. Once lubricated, wipe away any excess grease. Before you install the pressure plate, you will have to lubricate the release bearing as well. If you look closely at the inside of the release bearing, you'll notice that there is a groove. This groove is where you'll want to pack the release bearing with high-temp urea grease. Slide the friction disc and the clutch release bearing onto the clutch alignment tool and insert the clutch alignment tool into the pilot bearing. Then place the pressure plate over everything and align the pressure plate with the 3 dowel pins on the flywheel. Use a 10mm socket to tighten the 9 bolts, securing the pressure plate to the flywheel in a crisscross pattern in order to prevent warping. Finally, torque them to 19 foot-pounds. Now simply remove the flywheel ring gear holder that you fabricated, and you're ready to reinstall the transmission. If you like this video, be sure to give it a thumbs up and smash that subscribe button if you'd like to see more. As always, feel free to leave a comment down below with a video you'd like to see in the future. In my next video, I'll show you how to reinstall the transmission, so stay tuned.